Welcome to the second annual conference for veterans interested in buying a small business and scaling it. Veteran Entrepreneurship through Acquisition, ETA. My name is Bob Eisiminger, and I've been asked to open this national conference by telling you my success story, because it can be done. My story began in the military, first as an enlisted service member in the aviation, then as a cadet at West Point, and then as an officer serving in Germany in air defense. 9 Point Systems is the company that I founded and was the CEO from 2005 to 2019. And along the way, we learned a lot of lessons. But first, I think it's important to tell you how it started. And it started, of course, the way all good businesses start, over a beer. And it started as a desire to build something that we could grow, we could create the culture, we could make a difference in people's lives. And we really started an organization to make a difference. Now, of course, we obviously wanted to make money along the way. And I will tell you some of the very important lessons that we learned as we went. Cash flow is king. I will tell you that for the first 2 years, none of us took paychecks. And so that, I must have some pretty good sales skills if I was able to convince 4 other guys to leave their jobs and start to build an organization. Now, 15 years later, when we sold for $250 million, I can tell you that they were all thrilled they made that decision. But there were a lot of bumps and hiccups along the way. Growing a company is it's not the easiest thing in the world, but it can be a ton of fun. It can be a grind, 16-hour days, 7 days a week, trying to find exactly what you want to do. And when I started the company, we had a vision for a company that would serve information technology needs of the federal government. And we really started off as a value-added reseller. We quickly realized that we were growing too fast to do what we wanted to do, which was eventually sell the company and make some life-changing differences in our lives in terms of building some familial wealth. And so along the way, we pivoted quite a bit. Started out as a VAR. Growing too fast, we pivoted and became an infrastructure company. And a lot of it had to do with hiring the right people. And oh, by the way, the right people for us in many instances were subject matter experts that were, guess what, veterans. Hired a gentleman who was E6, Staff Sergeant of the Army, to help lead our infrastructure division. And that guy was phenomenal. Several years later, we hired another guy, a guy who'd worked at Cybercom, Army Cyber. We hired him, and he made a difference. And so it was all about hiring the right people and moving the needle forward. The journey's a fun one. I would encourage everyone to own your own business at one point. You learn a lot about yourself. You learn a lot about what you can put up with. You learn about perseverance. You learn to embrace the suck. And if you're in the military, you've already learned how to embrace the suck. You did that in your time in service. But what an amazing experience, and one that I would encourage all of you to embark on if you haven't already. Today, 2.5 million veteran-owned small business in the U.S. employ 6 million people and generate 1.1 trillion in annual revenue. 48% of these veteran owners are over age 65. Many of them don't have a succession plan in place. That represents a huge potential opportunity for all of you listening today, as well as potential opportunity for older veterans ready to sell and retire. I encourage you to pursue your entrepreneurship dreams. ETA clearly works. More than 1.4 billion of equity capital has been invested in search funds and their acquired companies, generating an estimated 6.9 billion of equity value for investors, 1.8 billion of ETA searchers with a cumulative IRR of 32.6 and a return on investment of 5.5. But critical to success, information. And today you're going to get a lot of that. Today you're going to hear from some of the top people in the field, so listen up. Put any questions you have in the chat and speakers will try and respond. And now it's my distinct honor to hand off the microphone to Colonel Scott Jensen, retired, the Executive Director of the National Veteran Small Business Coalition, the co-host of this event.
Thank you, Bob. Today, VetsETA conference was founded by the National Veteran Small Business Coalition and the investment bank sbLiftOff. As Bob said, I'm Scott Jensen, the Executive Director of NVSBC. We help veterans succeed at government contracting, so let's talk about ETA. Entrepreneurship through acquisition has exploded at all the big business schools. It had its birth at Harvard in 1983, and since then, more than $1.4 billion of equity capital has been invested in search funds and their acquired companies. That investment has generated nearly $7 billion in equity value for investors. Not too shabby. Today, we have some of these investors present, and I'd like to take a moment to do a shout out to the Bryden Group, led by Army veteran Alex Mears. Bryden is among the nation's leading investors in ETA and is sponsoring our conference today. Thank you, Alex, and thank you, Bryden Group. If you're a veteran interested in cutting your own path and being your own boss, entrepreneurship through acquisition might be for you. The training you've received in the U.S. military will serve you well as you tackle ETA and later business leadership. Today's 2-hour conference is a quick graduate school refresher on some of the basics. Many of you tell us due diligence and negotiations was something you really needed help with. You'll be hearing from 2 pros on this topic today. Finally, you'll hear a panel on how to select a strong acquisition target. And of course, throughout this conference, you will hear from veterans who have done it, who have succeeded at ETA. In addition to trainings like this one today, NVSBC is working on some of the challenges that veterans face when they target a company that serves the federal government. As most of you probably know, the federal government sets aside billions of dollars every year in potential contracts for veterans. But getting those contracts and buying veteran-owned government contracting firms can be a headache. With help from our pro bono counsel, Baker Botts, we've been looking at some of these challenges. This is a significant legislative and regulatory challenge. As a 501c6, NVSBC hopes we can advance progressive policy ideas to remove barriers for young veterans who want to buy service-disabled veteran-owned small businesses. This policy review, and indeed today's conference, would not have been possible without the volunteer work of our Veteran ETA Planning Committee. Let me close by thanking that group of national thought leaders. Nancy Langer from sbLiftOff, Alex Mears from Bryden Group, Lisa Forrest from Live Oak Bank, Mike Mayer from Anacapa Partners, Mike Smith from PNC Bank, and Brennan Dignan from Baker Botts. Thanks again for all you guys have done to put this together. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our panelists, Mike Mayer and Alex Mears, who will lead a discussion on how to fund your search. If you have questions, please put them in the chat box and panelists will try to answer your questions. Alex and Mike, take it away.
Thanks very much, Scott. My name is Alex Mears. I'm a co-founder and managing partner at the Bryden Group. We are a veteran-led private equity fund that invests in the lower middle market through our CEO in Residence program. We approach ETA and search from a private equity angle. So my background, 20 years in private equity, started 20 years ago, was at Blackstone in their private equity group pre-financial crisis, and then left and joined the military for 5.5 years. I was an intelligence officer with the SEALs and spent quality time in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Indonesia before transitioning back to private equity 10 years ago. And until launching Bryden, was working at Carlyle doing software, government services, and business services. Pre-Bryden, we personally invested in over 70 searchers across the whole range of search models that Mike and I will talk about and that you'll hear about today, from self-funded to traditional. And then today at Bryden, we kind of have a third approach as well. But with that, I'll turn it over to Mike.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. Good morning. Welcome, everybody. Mike Mari here. I'm with Anacapa Partners. We're one of the leading investors in the search fund ecosystem. We've been engaged with this business model since the beginning, 30 plus years ago. Anacapa has been very active over the last 13 years of its existence, raising over $270 million of capital put to work in this ecosystem supporting entrepreneurs. We've invested in over 180 searches, many of those led by veterans, and we've closed on 70 plus acquisitions up to this point. My background prior to joining Anacapa, I have over 20 years of experience leading and operating companies and investing in private equity. I started out as a banker after getting my MBA at Stanford. And prior to that, I was a nuclear engineer and a submarine warfare officer. Got my degree out of the Naval Academy. Go Navy, got to put that plug in. One of the things that we pride ourselves on at Anacapa is our awareness of and sensitivity to the strengths and challenges that the veteran profile brings to entrepreneurship. And looking forward to meeting many of you on this call. Let's get started by talking about the multiple paths to entrepreneurship. Not all paths are created equal, and each one is going to be an individual choice. I think the first fork in the road that you need to be thinking about, or that first point in your decision tree, is whether or not to take investor funds. There are some obvious considerations. If you don't take investor funds, if you go the self-funded route, you have the advantage of flexibility and the opportunity potentially to own a greater share of the business. Obviously, with investor capital behind you, you're covering your expenses, your business expenses, you're drawing a salary, and of course you have immediate alignment with an investor group, which helps give some confidence to the business broker or the seller that you have investors lined up to do a deal. Another advantage of that model is simply having a built-in experienced network to provide business mentorship and deal advisory, but we'll go into some more details on those. I think Alex, you want to talk about some of the variations here in the funded model?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Mike. So there are kind of three different subgroups within the funded model. So the most common, which if you pick up the Stanford study that's published every 2 years, which I strongly recommend, basically is the traditional search fund model, right? So that is typically someone out of business school goes and raises capital from anywhere from 10 to 15 investors. That investor base is a range of institutional investors that focus on investing in search, like Anacapa, to high net worth individuals, former searchers, mentors, things like that. But once that capital is raised, and think round numbers around $500,000, that capital is then used to fund a search over 2 years. So that will pay a salary to the searcher during that period. That pays travel expenses, a lot of steak dinners with small business owners, deal expenses, things like that during the diligence phase. And then when the searcher ultimately finds a business, they then take that deal back to that investor base, and the investors have the option to fund the deal at the transaction time. A couple of important things as you're thinking about fund and search, as with all search, is really trying to build your cap table to be supportive. And so bringing in equity investors who complement your skill sets and who have experience investing in search is incredibly important. The second sort of option within funded is kind of the accelerator model. So there are several accelerators, which is very similar to traditional, but they will do kind of 90 to 100% of the equity, typically backing similar profile, generally individuals out of business school. Pros and cons that we can certainly talk about if there are questions on that, but they are focused sort of one-on-one with a group of searchers. And then the last bucket, which is what Bryden does, is the private equity backed search. So we are a $100 million private equity fund, and we select 6 CEOs and residents a year who are typically more mid-career. So think 3 to 10 years out of business school and are industry focused. And we provide 100% of the capital and due diligence support and everything like that as we work with our CEOs and residents to find a small business to acquire.
As we said, it's a personal choice, and I think some of the key dimensions you might want to consider here when you're making those decisions about whether to take investor funds or not, and if you take investor funds, what kind of funds. In a more concentrated environment, as Alex described with Bryden, or in a more diversified environment with a broader group of investors, like the model which we execute through Anacapa. Probably chief among those, which is going to come to mind to most people considering this path, is how much control you have in the context of equity ownership. And if you bring on investors, obviously investors are putting up the capital. They're going to expect to collectively have a majority ownership in the business. Obviously, if you go to the self-funded path, you can have a much larger stake in that equity. I think a trade-off that goes hand in hand with that is the size of the deal. Do you want a larger piece of a small pie, or do you want a smaller, moderate piece of a much larger pie?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. And another key feature as you think about the range of models, and again, to Mike's point, there's no right answer when it comes to which model. It's very much personal preference where you as a searcher are in your life, and kind of what you are solving for in terms of size of business and some of these other factors. The next one is kind of flexibility. So with self-funded, it does provide a lot more geographic flexibility. Most funded searches, investors would have the expectation that would either be regional or national, meaning that if a searcher found a great business, 6 hours from where they were living, the expectation is that they would move to be the CEO there. Whereas self-funded, you could launch tomorrow, and if you are have to live in one city, a very specified location or geographic, it's a great way to pursue that. The second thing with flexibility, and I think this one cuts both ways, is that there tends to be a lot more flexibility around the type of business you can acquire if self-funded. So with traditional search and certainly with both accelerator and otherwise, the criteria tend to be pretty strict on recurring revenue businesses, mission critical, things like that. Whereas with self-funded, you can literally buy any business in America. And as I said, I tend to view that very much as a cuts both ways, because there are a lot of businesses that first-time CEOs, which is what a searcher generally is, will struggle to grow and things like that. And so I think generally the criteria as they're laid out, and you can see in the Stanford study and elsewhere with search, have been laid out for very good reasons, from many years of experience and things like that with a lot of investors and a lot of searchers. So, but that flexibility piece is a consideration as you're looking at several different search options. And Mike, if you want to hit some of the kind of key differences in economics as well.
Yeah. As I mentioned, the size of the pie is going to matter. In a traditional search with investors behind you, they're going to be looking to put capital to work, and so there's going to be a minimum size that below which it's not going to make sense for them. Typically, we like to target businesses that are generating, $1.5 million or more of EBITDA or operating cash flow. Obviously, in a self-funded search, with the flexibility to do anything you want, you can go much smaller than that. What that impacts to you, what that should mean to you is the size of the outcome. If you look at that Stanford study, I think the average outcomes for entrepreneurs in a funded search model is north of 8 million. It's sort of in the $8 to $10 million range. That's after a 5-year hold. That's pretty good. If you've got a much smaller business with a much greater share, depending on the growth dynamics and what your exit options are, you may be able to do that or better. It all depends. That's one consideration, thinking about how much wealth, potential is out there down the road for you. The other issue is simply current income, right? While you're searching, and in a traditional search, by the way, again, the Stanford study will tell you, in a traditional search, it takes about 2 years. I think 18 months is the average for acquiring a company. So during that time, you're drawing a salary from the search fund. In a self-funded model, you're supporting yourself. If you have the means to do so, that's great. Not everybody has those means. And so that's something else you want to think about, is the opportunity cost of that capital during your search time. And I think not only do you have sort of personal and family economic risk and reward trade-offs to think about, but there's some other personal risks here that you want to think about too. And maybe Alex, you can cover that piece.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Mike. And not to go down too much of the rabbit hole on the financing options for self-funded versus a funded search, but it is actually fundamental to the risk profile of doing it. So I do want to touch on it very quickly, and we'll hear more from Lisa Forrest in a bit on those funding options. But because self-funded searchers often use what's known as an SBA 7A loan, which is a government-backed program that basically provides subsidies for loans up to $5 million. There are a lot of restrictions and stipulations around the use of that loan. That is why it is typically only done by self-funded searchers. Traditional search investors and traditional searchers typically don't access that type of funding for a whole host of reasons. One of the unique features of the SBA 7A loan for self-funded searchers is that it does require a personal guarantee by the searcher when they are acquiring a business. And so this is something that we, when I'm working with veterans sort of considering all the models, this is something to consider. To Mike's point, obviously there's a lot of upside in these models, but you also have to be cognizant of some of the downsides. And so with a personal guarantee, obviously that is something that is a very personal decision, but could be pretty significant personal risk in a downside scenario. In traditional search, it tends to be more if the business is not going well, the CEO simply steps down from the CEO role, leaves, and the board will replace them with a new CEO. And so as you're thinking about that kind of risk reward, where you are in your career, where you are potentially, from a family situation, a financial situation, that is something that is one of the key kind of defining features if you decide to go self-funded with an SBA 7A loan versus traditional. Now, there are obviously some advantages to the 7A loan program as well that I know Lisa will cover, but that is really as we look at it, kind of some of the key risks just to be aware of. The second piece on the risk spectrum to what Mike mentioned earlier, there are pros and cons of having very experienced investors sitting on your board in your equity cap table, and so my recommendation is if people sort of decide to not pursue the funded route, that you really try to at least replicate that somewhat if you're doing self-funded with mentors and investors. It's a little bit harder than traditional search because it's kind of baked into the way traditional search works, but given how critical, leveraging a lot of other people's knowledge of what they've seen that works well and does not work well in small businesses, how to deal with hiring issues, how to deal with, post-close legal issues, things like that. Having a dedicated group of kind of mentors and advisors, whichever model you pursue, is absolutely critical. And obviously that is sort of, as I said, baked into the DNA of the funded search model. And it's something that I think self-funded searchers, it's definitely doable, but it's more work to kind of carve that out.
In fact, let me add, Alex, that in the traditional model, we're pretty typical of most of the investors in that environment, as is the Bryden Group. We go through a great deal of pains to get to know the entrepreneur really well, and vice versa. And we preach it's really important that the entrepreneur be very careful about selecting their investors. Select those investors with whom you're aligned from an investment appetite standpoint, and somebody who you're going to feel comfortable and you trust taking advice from. So it's a very personal decision. It's very relationship driven. But I will say that no matter who you choose within those investors that are very familiar with this model, you're going to get a lot of expertise.
No, it's a great point. And to the duration of the relationship, I mean, if you think the average search is around 2 years to find a business, and then average hold periods can be anywhere from 4 to 10 years. This is really a long-term relationship that you're entering into with your investors. And so making sure you're partnering with people who share your values, are aligned on the business, the strategy, who you are, and what you want to do as a CEO, regardless of the model you pursue, is absolutely critical. I think the last kind of key difference as you think, as you're thinking through potentially some of these different models is just the availability of resources to your search. The good news is there are, regardless of the model, today a lot more resources than there were even 5 years ago, candidly, that are out there. So, there are now multiple books that have been written on search and ETA. Obviously, the Stanford study and some of the exhibits can be very helpful. But also there are a whole range of podcasts, newsletters, things like that can help get people educated about the various models and about search more broadly in a way that, again, even 5-10 years ago, they were not available. But that said, I mean, I think there is certainly a sort of clear trade-off in terms of the resources with the different models. So being self-funded, again, because you're waiting till the end, till the deal is basically almost done to bring in investors. The resources you're going to be getting from third parties tend to be more limited from investors, candidly. And so that's a consideration. How comfortable are you doing business due diligence? How comfortable are you understanding kind of the ins and outs of acquisitions of small business due diligence? And we'll talk a little bit more on diligence in a bit. But that is something that if you pursue a self-funded route, which is we've seen a lot of very, very successful veterans pursue that route. That is something from a resource perspective that's going to fall on you to sort of make that happen. In the funded model, again, you're sort of stepping into more of a structure where you're able to leverage a lot of the resources and learnings of investors and searchers who've gone before you. And so think everything from as silly as Excel templates on data requests and how to negotiate a sale and purchase agreement, all the way to kind of really helping in the operating phase from a board perspective. And so obviously with that involvement, there is some a searcher is trading a little bit of control for that, but that's again just a personal consideration that the a prospective searcher has to make as they're kind of viewing like how much in terms of resources do you want to step into as you think about the various models, and as you think about becoming a CEO and an owner of a small business.
Yeah, the pattern recognition that you're going to get from your group of investors is truly valuable. It also has a downside. It may present you with an answer that you don't want to know. You may fall in love with a deal, have investors who maybe see some risk that you don't necessarily see, and that can create an opportunity for you to move on to a better deal, or it can create some tension between your investors. So I think making sure that you're aligned with that group up front is really, really important. I think we got time for a few questions, Alex.
Okay.
I had one that I spotted here that looked kind of. Can you pursue a self-funded search while you're working? Sure, you can. I think one of the keys to success here is focus and momentum when you're in the deal business. So sure, it's something you can do on the side while you're continuing to hold down another job. But it's going to be a little bit of distraction, and it's probably going to take you a little bit longer than it otherwise would. In the traditional model, or in an accelerated or concentrated investor model, we're much more focused on you being focused on the search, and so that in fact is why investors fund a draw or a salary for the searcher during that time period, so they can stay focused on the search and not get distracted by another job.
Yeah. I would just add, Mike, on the self-funded side, we've seen it, a lot of self-funded searchers who maybe start dipping their toes in part-time while they're working another job, but just candidly, like doing full due diligence on a business, really reaching out to a lot of brokers and business owners, which is what you need to find, the one right business, tends to be something that people pretty quickly transition to full-time in our experience. And it's not that it's impossible to do part-time, but it is something that, certainly as a friend, I would recommend someone do this full-time, regardless of, they will do it full-time if they do traditional or accelerator, but even self-funded, just given how much time, candidly, you dedicate to doing this. One question on service disabled veteran-owned small businesses, or SDVOSBs. Which, for those not familiar, those are government contractors who benefit from small business and service disabled veteran-owned small business set-asides. Meaning there are a certain portion of every federal agency's contracting budget is earmarked for service disabled veteran-owned small businesses. So the question was on how does the funding affect the status? So the short answer is basically if you are going to acquire an SDVOSB, it almost certainly has to be done through a self-funded search. It is very difficult to do through a traditional search structure where you have a series of outside investors, institutions, et cetera. And so that is something that if pursuing an SDVOSB is exactly what you want to do. I think not that it's impossible to do in the traditional search model, but it's much harder. And so generally we've seen self-funded searchers pursue SDVOSBs.
Yeah, question about growth strategies here in the chat box. We're looking for probably three basic things. I mean, there's a lot of criteria that we think about when we're investing in a search, but probably three things that we're looking for are a fundamentally sound business. We don't do turnarounds. We don't do startups. We buy existing cash flowing businesses. That's sort of basic to private equity. And we're looking for alignment with you. Is it a great fit for you? Is it the right business for you to run? And again, with that years of pattern recognition, we kind of see that. And third, and this gets to the heart of the question here, is we're looking for growth opportunities. So we'll buy a business that has reasonably good momentum. Like I said, we don't buy turnarounds. But then we're looking at, are there some line of sight opportunities to create an inflection point for growth? And one of those growth paths could be through acquisition. It's not something that we want to hang our hat on necessarily right out of the box. But once you, as the entrepreneur, get comfortable with how you're running the business and the key value creation levers, M&A as a part of that growth strategy is very doable. And we as investors are happy to fund that path if it's a well thought out plan and a very good opportunity. And then there are other growth paths as well that include expansion into an adjacent service, expansion in an adjacent geography, things like that. And by the way, in terms of value creation, I sort of skipped past it, but basic value creation early on is simply professionalizing the business. Again, your investor group, if you choose the traditional funded path, your investor group has run businesses. They've provided governance and oversight for many businesses, and they're going to be in the best position to help you identify those areas where you can professionalize the business, improve margin, improve quality of the service to your customers, and grow organically before you even need to think about growing through M&A or through additional services.
Thanks, Mike. There was a question on kind of 2 to 3 most important things a prospective searcher will get from an MBA. So I would say, and Mike, jump in with your experience. I would say certainly the majority, probably vast majority of searchers do pursue MBAs, but not all. I think from my perspective, I mean, what's unique about this model is when you are a first-time CEO, almost all of our CEOs are surprised by just the breadth of knowledge you have to have, right? Like you go from setting the compensation plan, setting the benefits, the medical benefits, to talking through, your accounts receivable collections, to hiring, to strategy. So you're basically kind of moving up and down at all levels within an organization, and especially a small business where typically you don't. It's not like a large business that has a large the CFO has a large team and there's dedicated controllers and there's a large HR team and things like that. Oftentimes the CEO, you as a CEO of a small business, you're wearing many of those hats. And so, I think from what CEOs we've backed who have have gone and done their MBAs, that's often what they talk about. It's just having that broader exposure and understanding, because there are very few, I would say, work experiences that can replicate being a CEO for the first time. But having at least that exposure and understanding of a lot of those different functional areas and different ways to drive value in the company is incredibly important. Okay. A couple other questions on SBLiftOffs. Would having it limit exit opportunities and some of the other investing opportunities there? The short answer is yes. So it's actually something that NVSBC has been great about, trying to spearhead the ability to bring some additional capital and allow for some institutional capital to help support veterans buying SBLiftOffs, because the issue is today just the way that the regulations are written, it's extraordinarily difficult. And so that absolutely puts kind of a limit on the valuation of those businesses, right? So that not only affects existing veteran small business owners who have SBLiftOff status, but obviously invests or impacts a searcher as you're thinking about potential exit opportunities if you buy an SBLiftOff and are thinking about exiting in 5 to 10 years. Okay.
One final comment on resources before we turn it over here. You'll find plenty of resources online. We mentioned the Stanford study. The Stanford Center for Entrepreneurial Studies produces a white paper every other year that catalogs all of the known search funds in their universe and provides some great data there. They also provide a primer if you want to go down the traditional self-funded path, or the traditional funded path. They provide a primer for how to do that. You'll also find many publications through Harvard, Chicago Booth, Wharton, Kellogg, et cetera, that provide good thought and guidance for making your decision here about whether to go down a funded or a self-funded path. So we're going to move on to panel 2, funding your acquisition. I'm going to take it away. Lisa Forrest, very active participant in this ecosystem, has funded many deals. I see one of our CEOs, Vince Kuchar, on the screen now. Vince is a recipient of Live Oak's debt funding and doing a great job. So Lisa, take it away.
Thanks so much. Thank you so much, Alex and Mike, for setting up a little bit of the context and the background for what we'll be talking about on the rest of our minutes here we have. I'm Lisa Forrest. I'm co-director along with my partner, Heather Anderson, our Live Oak Bank Search Fund Sponsor Lending vertical at Live Oak. I'm the civilian on the panel here, so I'm just going to be a little bit of a river guide, and all of the comments and and commentary will be coming from our two veterans, veterans to CEOs who have actually done this thing. We're so excited to have two of my favorite people here. Vince Kuchar, he is operator CEO of RMC. And for the obviously the veterans that have joined us today, it's a really interesting business that Vince has acquired. I'll let him tell you a little bit about that. And then we have Dan Zastro, who acquired Remedy Rooter, a plumbing company. Different paths, self-funded versus traditional. We're here to hear their stories and ask some questions along the way. I'll be kind of manning the Q&A, so if you've got some questions that I don't think we're going to get to, I'll kind of pick those up and we'll get to them as we go. So having said that, Vince, why don't we start with your story? Tell us a little bit about your military background and how that has set the stage for you to do this. And then Dan will do the same for you, and then we'll talk about the paths that you picked.
Sure, Lisa, happy to jump in, and great to be here with everyone, and thanks to our sponsors. So let me introduce myself, Vince Kuchar, CEO of RMC. My story starts, I'll go back to undergrad, Clarkson University, small school in upstate New York, only known for our hockey and cold weather for the most part, but graduated from there, and 9/11 happened while I was in school, and it called me into the military through our OTC program. So I joined the Army, spent 10 years on active duty, most of that in the 75th Ranger Regiment, and then from there went back to school. I got my MBA, which frankly, I was pretty burned out at the time, lots of time overseas, and I needed to take a knee. So I've seen some questions in the chat around, hey, what's the value of MBA? What are the 2 to 3 things I might get out of it if I pursue one? For me, part of it was just, hey, it gave me the opportunity to invest back in my family and take a break. Of course, it helped me learn and presented me with tremendous opportunities. And when I left, I went to Boston Consulting Group for about 5 years. And then after that, found my way to RMC. I'll quickly introduce RMC. RMC is a risk management services company. So we do mission assurance services. We are a government contractor. Most of our revenue comes from the federal government, but we also do serve some Fortune 500 companies. And our other focus beyond mission assurance is industrial cybersecurity. So if it doesn't talk like a computer, we say, hey, if it doesn't speak TCP/IP, then we touch it. So think of everything that connects our electrical grid, our utility systems, a production plant. All of those devices are now connected to the internet, and we help to make them more cyber secure. So that's a little bit about RMC. And, Lisa, thank you for the flattering comment. It's been wonderful to work with Live Oak and yourself over the last few years, and excited to talk more about funding here in a second.
Great. Okay, thank you for that. Dan, take it away.
All right, well, sounds great. Well, hello, everybody. My name is Dan Zastro. Thanks to Lisa and Heather, just for what it's worth, and for everyone in the audience, you'll hear this a ton. Live Oak is super, super good. Not only are they helpful, I think it's sort of made themselves sort of the leaders in the space, and they want to do it, but they have the people, they have the departments, they have the infrastructure and processes. Like super easy to say you want to go do something, but they actually like built it out. And you'll be able to feel that and tell that if you at any point go down, looking for debt financing with multiple providers. Like it's very different, and they're wonderful. So to that, and thanks for having me. So my story, I studied engineering in school, electrical engineering. I spent 7.5 years as a submarine warfare officer, like Mr. Maury here. I love the people and the challenge. Spent 6 or so years in corporate, in a medical technology company, manufacturing, product management. Did MBA at Wharton. A little more background. Yes, I was an academy guy, class of 2006. Each time an academy grad misses the chance to tell people that a fairy dies somewhere, try to make sure I got the word out. And so a little bit of what brought the search was corporate just sort of wasn't for me. Parts of it I loved, but so much of your sort of success in corporate, at least for me, depended sort of around sort of the infrastructure and things that often felt outside of my control. And so I was very drawn to the idea of being able to have a tighter link between your input and the outcome. And sure, there's always going to be sort of outside or sort of external variables, but I like that I feel much more in control. I've always been sort of drawn to the idea of leading a smallish group of sharp people solving hard problems, which seems like a very nice fit in the ETA world. I joke with people sometimes when I was getting out and go to interviews, you get to the end of the interview when they like you and they'd be like, so what do you really want to do? And I'd be like, well, I just want to lead a smart group of, or, a small group of smart people solving hard problems. And I'd be like, yeah, but like, what do you want to do? Like, do you want to be an engineer? Do you want to be in marketing? Like, I don't know. This is just what I want to do. And so when I first heard about search, it was sort of this aha moment. And so that's a bit about kind of the drivers for it. And today, like Lisa said, I got to own and operate a 16, 17 person plumbing company. There's no computers, no TCP IP. If it leaks, the water's not hot, it doesn't flush, that's us. We come out pretty fast and get it fixed, both residential and commercial, and that's the deal.
Great. Thank you for that background. I think it just is going to resonate with so many folks that are on live today and then also listening to the recording. So why don't we talk a little bit about what method of the search path you both chose and why? And then Dan, in particular, you've got a really interesting perspective on traditional and self-funded. Vince, why don't we start with you on your path and why that resonated, and then Dan, do the follow-up on that for us.
Yep, happy to share. And so my background, I was at Boston Consulting Group getting ready to stand up my search when RMC came to me very early in the process. So I didn't get the pleasure of running the full search process, which in some ways is criminal, but I also feel very fortunate and count my lucky stars every day. So RMC came to me through some other search relationships. And then closed the deal and kind of stepped in within 4 months of learning first about RMC. And I just had to make some bold moves to leave BCG quickly to do this and pursue my passion, which, much like Dan, I just wanted to lead teams of smart people against the unified mission and purpose. And what's so special about RMC is this is a purpose-driven company, still serving our country, still focused on critical infrastructure and solving hard problems. It felt so core to who I am. And so one of my key messages is, we talked a lot about, and Mike and Alex talked a lot about the personal decision of traditional versus self-funded. Some of that you won't know until you kind of dive in and really think about things. But, don't over-index too much on, hey, what industry am I trying to solve for? What kind of company do I want a SaaS business? Do I want a services business? You may not be able to answer some of those questions, but your gut and your search may pull you in the direction of your passion and purpose. And certainly that has worked out for me at RMC. So what I can speak more to, rather, since my path was kind of chosen for me and I went down the traditional search path straight to closing, was the funding process and closing the deal. So of course, during diligence, you're doing a lot of work. You're getting your quality of earnings. You've got your other service providers, both accounting or contractual in nature, to review contracts, and then of course you have your legal team. And I'm going to take a second to talk about your legal team because it is such a critical component of the diligence and the search, not just on the operating agreement and all the funding piece. It is super critical on helping you manage your debt and also work with your debt provider, because at the end of the day, you're going to have a series of documents through your debt provider, and this goes for both the SBA side and the non-SBA side. And one of those governing documents is called a loan service agreement. The loan service agreement can be anywhere from 40 to 100 pages. And it's, if you're like me, you're a vet, you don't have a law degree, that can be troublesome to get through. So one piece of advice I can offer is, depending on the size of the deal, depending on how much is needed with regard to legal support, specifically with regard to the funding and the debt structure of the deal, it's really, really important. And I can recommend that you spend the money to have the right legal team who knows some of your debt providers. So there are legal teams within the search ecosystem that all work heavily with a small segment of search debt providers. I was fortunate that our legal team did know Live Oak really well and their external counsel. So when it came down to the negotiation of the loan service agreement, the bank covenants, all of that, it was a fairly seamless process, and it made it very easy for a non-lawyer veteran to figure out what it means when I'm staring at a 100-page loan service agreement. And so, one piece of advice there. And then on the traditional side, I would say there are a segment of 5 to 10 debt providers that are pretty core to the traditional search segment. There are some new entrants there as well, worth exploring. But I think as long as you stay within that core, the process will be pretty seamless if you have the right legal support. Back to you, Lisa.
Great. Thanks, Vince. God, what a way to scare everyone off by talking about the LSA on the conference. That's great. Thank you so much for those comments. Really appreciate that. And Dan, why don't you tell us your story? You got to see both sides of the path, and then you ultimately aligned on self-funded. So walk us through that.
Absolutely. So I was, on the time machine, it was 2019. I was at work, not loving it. And a friend from the submarine and I would talk every month or so, and we kind of throw ideas at each other and be like, oh, my cousin's buddy has a company that makes bolts for brake pads. And be like, oh, that sounds cool. And they'd be like, oh, what about this? What about that? And then one day, even a Stanford guy, one day he called and was like, hey, there's this thing called a search fund. And I was in business school, but I hadn't heard of it. And I was like, okay, well, what's that all about? He's like, well, you get this group of amazing people behind you. You get to go out and learn how to buy a company, and then you get to run it. Oh my God, this sounds way too good to be true. It's not too good to be true. Just everybody, it's good, but there's no free lunch here. And so it was fantastic. We went out and got a wonderful group of talented and kind and thoughtful people behind us, and spent 18 months as a very much sort of center of the fairway traditional search fund. 18 months in, I was having a life change, but this is not a group for euphemism, which means I was pretty sure, and then I did end up getting divorced and have a couple kids, and so no longer was geographically flexible. And it was a weird mix of where personal and professional were very tied in a way that if you have an office job, they're not. And so pretty quickly went from having an income and sort of a paid off condo to, no income and rent, and that's okay. And so we went and talked to all the investors. And as a quick, just sort of side note, as a testament to Mike and to Jeff with him at Anacapa, along the way, he certainly provided mentorship and investment advice and help, but he was just kind and good to me, kind of as a man, as a human being, when going through that, and just for everyone to hear it. There's good people in search, and Mike definitely stands out as one of them. And so, but nonetheless, the idea of going to sort of buy and run a business was as, intoxicating and sort of as attractive as ever. And so persevered, and my partner and I, we still went out and tried to do it. And so then spent the next 9 months or so trying to close, and ultimately closing on a self-funded deal. The sort of the barometer shifted, or the kind of goalpost shifted from finding a wonderful business to finding a business now, here. I did not like corporate. I used to joke about people. I was like the rappers, talking about jail, and I'm not going back alive. I'm just not doing it. And so I was very set on it, but it was I was solving a different problem. I wasn't out trying to get a 35% IRR. I wanted to get into something and get in the game and get behind the desk, or, get in the game really. And so where it ended up was that, so my partner and I, we ended up buying 2 businesses together. He runs a florist business in Dallas. I'll be out in a few days to get ready for Valentine's Day, which is a wild thing. And then I run the plumbing company here. And so that's, a bit about it with traditional, right? There's help, there's resources. With self-funded, there's just much less. But I'll also say it's a little bit unfair to say, because I got to learn so much in the beginning, that at least when I was out on my own, last year was before, whenever you didn't know something, you could send a couple of emails, and within 24 hours, you could talk to 3 people who knew a ton about any topic, and you could get pretty smart on something. And then when you're on your own, you don't really have that. But also, the stuff isn't, like, fine. We didn't go to law school. We don't know how to read a 100-page loan service agreement. But it's also not, like, the people who did go to law school and doing it, they're no smarter than any of us on here. It's just you sort of have to, like, you got to spend your time and, like, noodle on it for a while, but it's not an unsolvable problem. So it's sort of taught a little bit to be a little bit more maybe self-sufficient and just, I can get an 80% understanding of these things, which turns out to be just a wonderful thing for actually sitting in the seat. And then I'll share a final thought, maybe 2 quick final thoughts on sort of self-funded versus traditional. I think it came up at some point during the search, this idea of, do you want to be rich or do you want to be king? And I think that a traditional search has a better chance of making you a fair amount of money quicker. And then self-funded, it's a little bit of a tough road. Not that traditional is easy by any means. But as time went on, and especially as Nick and I worked through the traditional part, I think it became more and more clear in our mind that it was, and not that I have this like need to be in charge, maybe I do, and I just don't want to admit it, but that it was a king more than rich. So just a thought of the autonomy and control you have. But of course, the flip side of it is that then you don't have some of the help. So it's a trade-off. That's the story.
Great, thanks, Dan. Before we move into a little bit of the numbers, because I know people tuning in are probably really curious about how your financing worked. What does a conventional, traditionally funded conventional loan look like? What are the equity and debt pieces and the seller role parts? And then from a self-funded standpoint, Dan, to the extent you're willing to share, what did your SBA loan look like? Before we do that, though, there was one question where someone asked to you, Dan, hey, can you actually make a living being a service contractor or in the specialty trades? Can you actually make a living?
Oh, yeah,
that was
for
a question.
sure.
Okay.
The business model is sound, for sure, particularly residential service and repair, whether you're HVAC, plumbing, electrical, solar. No, it's the business model is good. It's just my opinion on it. Yes.
Good. Well, we'll leave it there. We can have people reach out to you directly to get more of the details there, but I think that answered the question. And I'll throw roofing in there. We're doing a lot of roofing on the service contractors as well, too. So, Dan, Vince, why don't you walk us through what your conventional loan looked like? How much debt did you have? How much equity? And how did the seller participate in your cap stack?
Yep, happy to share. And I'll be speaking kind of generalities here, but we raised over 10 million in debt, which is, typical of a large traditional search deal. And therefore we did not have an SBA loan. We also, brought over $10 million to the table with regard to equity as well. The seller did participate in both an equity rollover as well as a seller note as part of the debt structure there. And we were very, very pleased with both the capital structure at the end of the day, and then we've been exceptionally pleased with our seller relationship, which isn't always the case in ETA, but for RMC, who has grown over 20% the last 2 years in a row since we've closed the deal. I hit my 24-month anniversary here in May. And the enterprise value of the business is up 50%, revenue is up 50%, EBIT is up 50%, headcount's up. It's just been an incredible growth story. And a lot of that has to do with our relationship with the sellers and the existing leadership team and core talent that was in place before we got here. So, one thing I can talk a lot about, which, isn't a part of this debt and financing discussion, is how do you do a good transition, and how do you lead with authenticity, and how do you step into an organization and really show that you care and you have the organization's interest in mind. And, not to go off on too much of a tangent, but you've heard a lot about traditional search and shorter timelines on this call, around 5 years, right? That's not our plan at all, right? We may have a recap, refi, maybe even an exit within 5 years, but I'll tell you, my personal plan is to be here for a long time. I love this company. I love the people that work here. and I plan to stick around for as long as I possibly can, and then maybe into the decades in terms of time, if they'll have me, of course. But getting back to debt structure, it was a large raise on the debt side, and then the seller note is ultimately debt as well. So, we had roughly 3 times EBITDA with regard to our debt raise. That's a general rule, I think, in the traditional search space as far as how much debt you can raise, 2 to 3 times EBITDA. And that's typically for EBITDA that is going to be in the general range of 6 million or below. When you get to 6 million, and depending on the quality of the revenue and the EBITDA and the growth profile of the company, depending how stable it is and depending on that quality, you can of course raise more and have more turns on that EBITDA with regard to the amount of debt you do raise. So that's just a little bit on our structure. And Lisa, not sure if you want me to comment on anything else or go in any other directions, but that's a quick overview on how we did it.
Great, thanks. I think that's really helpful. Dan, why don't we compare and contrast on how an SBA loan looks, because it's very, very different.
It sure is. So we had a $2.2 million purchase price. The company was about 2.4 of revenue and about 400,000 of EBITDA. The way our structure was, it was a 5% seller note. It was about 15% equity, and then 80% with a 7A loan. So that's about 85% debt to equity. Thinking about it a different way, that's about 4.75 turns of debt. This is, I think, I know this is sort of how the game is played on the 7A loan side of things. It just is. I will mention very sort of just openly, cash is tight. Like, it is a real thing. And I think for those of you considering what you want to do with the company, particularly in the short term, if you want to grow, you need more equity, because a ton of our cash goes into servicing our debt. And without a question, some of our growth and sort of plans is constrained by the cash we have. I think it's fine. We're meeting everything. We have, at least today, we got cash in the bank. There's just not a ton of wiggle room. And so we think of us, we're maybe 85%, 85-15 debt to equity. Right? It doesn't always spell it out, but let's call it 50-50 or 40-60, maybe round numbers. You just have a little more, you can do a little more. But, again, just trade-offs are just different approaches. I hope to be doing this for 30 years. This is it. And so we'll work through it. And if we can, continue to kind of grow a bit, they'll sort of help. So that's it. We maybe, and just for a little more context, on any given month, we're making anywhere from $250,000, and 21,000 of that is going to our good friends at Live Oak, and then another 2.5 or so is going back to our good friends, the sellers. But that's it. Like, there's no, getting into it, and everything works out, and like the projections, they've sort of held true, and that's how our capital stack works.
And Vince mentioned the transition plan and the idea of having an idea of how you're going to transition the seller. It's important whether you're in a traditional, conventional model or loan structure, and especially important for the SBA, as Dan is mentioning. You're out there. It's highly leveraged. That's how it's meant to be on an SBA transaction. You need to really make sure you've got your transition plan down. In particular, what's the seller's role? What is the seller doing in that company? And can you really legitimately, adequately come in and replace that seller? Dan, do you want to dive into that little thing called the personal guarantee? Because that is a big difference between our conventional lending at, when we've got EBITDAs of 3, 4, 5, 6 million on the conventional side versus maybe, sub million of EBITDA for our SBA transactions. That personal guarantee comes along with that SBA loan. So tell us how you sort of thought about that and how you, I assume, got comfortable with it.
That little guy, I wouldn't worry about that little guy. So everyone calls it a PG, personal guarantee, which sort of makes it sound not so bad. And then I remember getting close to one of the deals, one of the banks was like, Dan, look, like unlimited and unconditional personal guarantee. And you're like, oh, well, that sounds a little different. here's just my 2 cents on it. To me, it means you can't walk away. The bank does not want to own your business, I'm pretty sure, and your retirement accounts can't be pledged as collateral. And it sounds scary, but also I would encourage anyone considering their paths to go out and find all the different articles that AJ Wasserstein over at Yale writes. And he has one, and it's something like on the nature of search fund outcomes. And he talks about where a company does great. He talks about where a company crashes and burns. And then there's the absolute scariest outcome where a traditional funder is in something and everybody, I think, kind of knows from the get-go that it's just not, it's never going to be anything. And there's a story someone who spends 4 years just toiling while watching all their peers either build more equity or make more money or just do other things, because you do, there's sort of an obligation and a commitment to the investors behind you, and you want to do the right thing. So that is how I thought about it. I mean, you can't walk away, but you can't walk away from traditional either. Can't, sort of, probably shouldn't, is an opinion. And it's just part of the game. So, and it's also kind of a little bit of a bet on yourself. If you believe in the industry, if you believe in the company, and if you sort of believe your thesis, which for us was like, will the future, do I have high enough confidence that the future will be as good or, as good as the past? Well, then go for it. And then any upside is sort of, you get some of that. So that's how I got comfortable with it.
Great, thank you. So we've got just a couple of minutes left, and I thought we'd sort of do that closing, that parting comment part of the session here. And we've talked about this for many years, how to get the awareness of ETA for our veterans. It's nothing that's discussed when you're in your transition situations. It's something that that sort of comes to you well past transitioning. So we're trying to get the awareness out earlier on in your transition thought process. So what are your closing comments for your fellow military veterans on the ability and then just the idea around being your own CEO, owner? Vince, why don't you give us your following thoughts there, and then Dan, we'll just move on into you there.
Thanks, Lisa. I have to agree with Dan. It's a bet on yourself, but you can do it, right? This you don't have to be rich. You don't have to be a genius. You don't have to have an Ivy League degree. You can do it. But it does take a couple of things. It takes grit for sure. Without a doubt, it takes a ton of grit, both on the traditional and the self-funded side, without a doubt. So grit is probably what veterans have the most of, and interesting life experience. And those two things can really set you up for success. So, I love ETA. It's going to be where I spend the rest of my life in this general world of the lower middle and middle market. It's really been an awesome place for me to grow as a leader and as a person, and I enjoy it a lot. I talked a little bit about so that's kind of point number one. Point number two, I'm a former consultant, so everything comes in 3 points. So point number two is on the debt funding piece. Make sure you have a good legal team. If you're going to be doing a traditional search, it will serve you well, and it will save you a lot of time, energy, and angst. And then the third one is, and we didn't really get to talk about this much, but your relationship with your debt provider is not just about getting the deal funded. The day that deal closes, things change, right? COVID could hit. You could run into payroll challenges, cash flow challenges. You could have to all of a sudden hire a ton of people to serve a big new contract you won, which would be super exciting. But all of that could have impacts on your bank covenant. So as we think about this and have this discussion, don't just think about this in terms of funding the deal and getting the debt to do that. It is a long-term relationship. And we at RMC with Live Oak have had a really strong relationship with Lisa and her team. And, things changed for us, fortunately for the better and for the good, but we've had to have conversations, and it's been very collaborative. So don't just think about who you're choosing in terms of getting the deal done. Think about it as a long-term collaborative relationship. And I guarantee post-close, things will change and you'll have some hard discussions, but you'll get through it as long as you find the right trusted partner.
Great. Thanks, Vince. Okay, Dan, we got a minute for you. What would your advice be?
Perfect. You can super do this. You can do it. The veteran profile is attractive to capital providers. It makes it easier to relate to owners, which is an important part of this game of sitting across the table and having an owner look at you and think that you have a reasonable chance of succeeding with their company. That's super important. You don't have to be rich. You don't have to go to fancy schools. Your parents don't have to have done fancy jobs. Like, that's, I think, helpful. On the military side, you have the ability to think, prioritize, and then stay sort of calm and like keep your composure, even if you're feeling, just like a little pinch of pressure. That goes a long way. And a final thought would be, to the extent you can over time when you go do this, develop a very simple story. Like, oh, well, I loved working with, technicians on the submarine, sort of a technical guy. And so that's why I'm interested in sort of, trades-based business. People are like, okay, great, check, I get it. Or just it helps. Thank you so much for giving us the chance. ETA is fantastic. It's changed my life for the better. I'm grateful every day to be here.
Thank you so much, Vince and Dan. Really appreciate it. And I'm going to now turn this over to Sharon and Alex to talk about diligence and negotiation, but we sure appreciate you, gentlemen. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Sharon, so I know you and I have talked at length about both due diligence and negotiations, and I know you have a pretty strong philosophy on both. Would you mind sharing that with the group?
I'd be delighted to. We generally work with, at sbLiftOff, we generally work with sellers. We do some buy work as well. I'm going to leave the buy side to Alex and talk a little bit more about the sell side. And it's important, even if you're the buyer, to understand what's going on for the seller. One of the things that we heard on the last panel was the trusted relationship that exists between the borrower and the bank. Well, there needs to be a trusted relationship actually between the buyer and the seller. And that trust is something that doesn't just happen, it gets built. If you're the seller, this panel is discussing negotiations and due diligence. The first due diligence that occurs is a seller doing due diligence on themselves. It's very important that you not simply assume that what you know about your company comes through easily. You really need to be looking at your company from a third-party perspective, because that's what the rest of the world is going to do. So it's pretty important that you think about, hey, if somebody comes in and looks at my chart of accounts or looks at the way I've staffed this or that contract, whatever it might be, that it makes sense. It also gives you an opportunity to make any changes that you think might be necessary, or to get ready to explain why it is you've done. So due diligence starts at home. It's not something that's only the other side doing to you. Second is, it continues throughout the process. It's never as though due diligence is something that is done and over, but rather you, as a seller, you start with due diligence. While you're negotiating with the buyer, you're doing due diligence on them as they're doing due diligence on you. And then, of course, once there's an LOI, there's yet more due diligence. So it's a continuing process. And the way to think about it, I think, is you are creating relationship and trust between the parties. Don't go into due diligence with the idea of, oh, let me see what I can hide. Let me see what I can get away with. You probably won't get away with it in the first place. And if you do, when you get to a closing, there's going to be representations and warranties in that agreement that are going to hold you liable for what it is you've said. So it's pretty important that you use the due diligence process to step into the shoes of somebody else and to say, if somebody who doesn't know my company is stepping in to actually run it, what do they need to know? Talk about both the strengths and the challenges. Don't hide those challenges for as long as you can. Talk about those challenges before you get to a letter of intent, because that's critically important to make sure that letter of intent is based upon reality. Alex, what would you like to say about due diligence from the buy side?
Yeah, I mean, from a buyer perspective, it's very similar. We always say building that key strong relationship, and candidly, a relationship based on integrity and trust is critical to getting a deal done. I mean, Sharon, as you know, deals take months to get done. They are stressful. There are a lot of questions. There are a lot of calls. There are a lot of diligence requests. And so building that relationship up front with the seller is critically important in our experience, and doing so with integrity, right? I mean, we can talk a little bit about some of the kind of the key red flags that we see in diligence, but partnering with a seller who has high integrity and has run their business with integrity, and then as a buyer, making sure you are approaching it with integrity, meaning if you say something, that is what you're going to do when you talk to a seller. If you give them a valuation, you're going to hit that valuation unless something crazy happens or something was hidden from you or something like that. But we've just seen over and over again that buyers and searchers who approach this process with that integrity, with the desire to build a genuine relationship with sellers, do much better. The second part of that, I would say, and Sharon, I'm sure you see this all the time on the sell side, is understanding what the seller is solving for, right? Every single small business owner in America is actually solving for something different when they sell their business. Some only care about cash at close. Some care deeply about their employees and the culture of the business. Some care about the future upside in the business and want to share in that. And part of what you're doing in those initial discussions and throughout your due diligence with the seller is really trying to understand what is important to the seller, and then how does that align with my views of the business, my desired operating plan, et cetera, and ensuring that you're having those conversations based on that mutual understanding is critical.
Very interesting. You talk about negotiations, and most people think of negotiations as give and take between the parties. I think of negotiations as really deeply listening, trying to understand, as you said, what is important both to yourself, but to the other side as well. Yes, of course, purchase price matters, don't want to imply that money doesn't matter, et cetera. But as you say, every seller has a different set of priorities, and truth is buyers do as well. Sometimes it's speed to close. Sometimes they want to get onto a certain cycle. It could be whatever it is. The reality is the best negotiations are where both sides are putting on the table what are their highest 1, 2, or 3 priorities, and maybe they're different. So everybody can get what are their priorities while making some accommodations to the other party. So negotiation is not only talking, it's primarily listening. One of the important elements of this due diligence process, and you've already said it, is that if a seller discloses things prior to that letter of intent, and the buyer goes forward with that letter of intent, the seller has a very realistic expectation that that buyer is going to close on the terms of that letter of intent. Sure, if something totally different comes up afterwards, then let's deal with that. That's an issue. But the circumstance where a buyer finds something out pretty significant, buyers tend to think one of two things. Either one, the seller didn't know about this, and that's a problem because how much control do they really have over their company? Or two, the seller did know about it and didn't disclose it, and that undermines trust. So it is such a better approach to be forthright and honest, both as the seller and the buyer, than it is to try and either hide something if you're the seller or go into an LOI that you don't really intend to close on as the buyer. That's not the way to create this relationship, and it will be a relationship ongoing.
Yeah. No, that's great, Sharon. And I know we both get a lot of questions about due diligence and kind of what that means and what that actually looks like. So generally in my head as a buyer, I bucket due diligence into 2 buckets, right? The first is functional diligence, where that's kind of legal, accounting, HR benefits, insurance, technical diligence if it's a software business. And generally with that functional diligence, you can rely on third-party advisors, or you'll work with third-party advisors on doing this. So you do not need to become an expert on the intricacies of contract law in order to buy a government contractor. You can partner with law firms that specialize in doing just this as part of the due diligence process. The second bucket, though, is business diligence or commercial diligence. And this is where you, as the searcher and prospective CEO and owner of the business, you are leading. And so, a few things, right? This is understanding the market. Who is this company competing with? Are they competing with a bunch of large players, small players? Is it a national competition or a very local competition? Understanding the customers and the contracts. So really getting to understand, what are customer, is there customer concentration? Is there, what are retention rates? Meaning, what percentage of their customers leave every year? Financial diligence. While you will be relying generally on an accounting provider to help do a quality of earnings, which is basically understanding, really unpacking the numbers and making sure that the profitability you're buying is there. But you as the searcher and the future CEO is absolutely critical that you understand way beyond that quality of earnings. You need to understand kind of what has driven growth recently, where, follow the dollar, like literally how does a dollar of revenue convert to cash in the bank account. And then the last couple, go to market, sales and marketing diligence is critical, and employee diligence, especially in small businesses where, you don't have large organizations, and oftentimes 1, 2, 3, 4 employees can be absolutely critical to the business. You need to understand that. It's not a deal killer, but you need to understand that during due diligence. Sharon, I don't know if you'd add anything on the diligence side.
Yeah, it's an excellent point. I think of diligence, you're right to be thinking of it as the functional and kind of the commercial business side. I think of it more in time periods, which is for the seller, what's the due diligence you're going to do on yourself before you go to market to find out what the problems might be. Second is, once you're in the marketing phase, we at sbLiftOff require buyers to do a fair amount of due diligence, mostly on the commercial side of the company. What does the company do? How does it do it? What level of customer concentration? Is there contract concentration? What are the challenges and strengths of that company? And we want that out there so that the buyer really knows what they're doing. When it comes to the operational or the due diligence for finance and legal and accounting and insurance and benefits, well, deals tend not to fall apart based upon insurance or benefits or legal issues, assuming that they have appropriate title to their company. So it's really understanding the commercial strengths and challenges of that company going into that LOI, and then doing what we refer to as confirmatory due diligence. That is, everything that was said to you prior to that LOI is in fact true. And one thing that sellers really need to understand is buyers are allowed to ask pretty much anything they want to. Now, one thing that buyers need to understand is that sellers occasionally say no. And the two things that sellers say no to, and you need to be sensitive to this as a buyer, is one, the buyer cannot generally talk to most of the employees. There may be 1 or 2 employees that are kind of in the know, but confidentiality is extremely important. And the buyer and the seller prior to the LOI should come to an understanding as to what level of communication can the buyer have with the seller employees prior to the closing. And that's a very major issue. The second is that buyers very often want to talk to customers. And sellers often have their hair go on fire at that moment. So one way in which we've dealt with those issues are kind of third-party studies of clients. Come in with third-party surveys to say, are you satisfied? Are you thinking about something that does not necessarily trigger in the client that there's going to be a transaction, but gives good value to both the buyer and the seller to understand what the relationships are with those clients. So the two areas of real sensitivity tend to be, what will the employees be told and when and how many of them? And then what the customers, what kind of contact, if any, with the customers will there be? From the buy side, Alex, how do you deal with those two issues?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think how we usually approach this is we totally understand that sensitivity, right? And so, but at the same time, at the end of the transaction, before we sign, if there are 1 or 2 absolutely key employees, or 3 or 4 key customers, we just say, hey, literally everything is done. The purchase agreement is negotiated. Literally the last thing we do before we sign, all the terms are agreed to, is we need to have those conversations. So that's one thing that we've seen to be effective, right? Is that basically everything is done. the seller has as high a confidence as you possibly can that this is a done deal. And then we have those conversations, because quite rightly, the seller does not want, or potentially does not want their entire employee base to know the business is for sale, nor do they potentially want all of their customers to know it's for sale either. And so being sensitive to the seller's requirements, while at the same time doing the due diligence that we need to do to get comfort buying a business is critical.
There are many analogies to buying a company and buying a house, or selling a house. When you sell a house, you basically put a huge sign out front that says for sale, and then you put advertisements in the newspapers and you tell everybody and you try and get the word out. When you're working on a business, confidentiality is king. It's incredibly important that that confidentiality remain, at least to the best possible. So maintaining that confidentiality with employees, with customers, certainly competitors, is pretty darn important. Figuring out ways to work together. And Alex, I think that you just put one of the major ones, which is the things that could, quote unquote, kill a deal, the quality of earnings, the negotiation of the legal documents. Get those things done before you start talking about, I want to talk to a customer. And there should be discussions beforehand as to whether employees will be brought in and which ones. Now, as a seller, there are ways of working with your employees, and there's a couple things to think about. One is you've tried to build trusting relationships with those employees. I have seen sellers keep the sale confidential until literally the day of closing, and have employees who have been with them for 20 years get incredibly hurt and offended that they found out at the same time that somebody's been working there for 6 months. So you want to think about it not only from a business perspective, but from a human perspective. What are the relationships and who can you bring in? So that's one. Two is, you're about to make a fair amount of money. God bless you, that's fantastic. If there are people who truly have been critical to your success in getting to that point, then maybe there should be some level of compensation for them as well. That could be done as a retention bonus. It could be done as a change of control. And there are ways to do that, and lots of lawyers and M&A advisors can talk to you about that. The one advice that I always give people, though, is please don't pay a huge amount of money immediately upon the closing of the transaction. If you're going to pay an employee, whether it's a retention bonus or a change of control, do it over a period of time. Pay some money upon the transaction closing, pay a little bit more 3 months later, a little bit more 6 months later, after 12 months. After every transaction, there's some sand in the gears. That first 2, 3, 4, 6 weeks can sometimes be still trying to figure out where the light switches are and something got dropped. You want to get people past those difficult times and keep them engaged, because part of what the buyer is buying is not solely the business, it's the people who make that business. So ensuring that those people stay there is pretty darn important.
Yeah, absolutely. And Sharon, I know one of the questions that we get a lot is kind of red flags in due diligence. Like, what are things that we see that tend to be problematic for buyers, either during diligence or post close as the owners of small businesses? So a few things, and obviously this will vary widely based on the business and everything else. But the first one is seller dependence. There are a lot, especially at the smaller end of the range of these businesses. You as a buyer need to make sure that there is enterprise value. There is a business that transfers. So if all of the seller's customers are their best friends in an industry, and it's a very personal relationship, and the seller performs all the work, that's very hard to transfer to you as the next buyer. You really want to make sure the business is transferable. So that seller dependence is something that's critical to kind of understand up front. The next is customer concentration. This is one we see over and over again. Everyone has different rules of thumb. We certainly do at Bryden, but think, if there's one customer or one contract, if it's a government contractor, that makes up 15, 20, 25, 30%, whatever that cutoff is, that can just create a lot of problems for you as a buyer. Generally, because the seller of a business will always have better information about the strength of that customer relationship and the contract. And you are essentially putting your hands the fate of the business in many cases in the hands of one customer, which when you are doing a leverage buyout, and whether you're doing a traditional search or self-funded, you're going all in on this. This is something that is critically important to understand up front. The next is one-time revenue. So that we see this a lot, and you've probably heard a few of us talk about the value of recurring or contractual revenue. And basically all that is that, hey, you have customers who every year come back and there's a contractual reason or recurring reason that they do. That's just a much easier business to run, to manage, to grow than one where January 1st of every year you have to start from zero. So think like a new home construction or something like that, where you're done with that project, you have to go and win all your revenue all over again. So that's something where businesses with too much one-time revenue, especially in the search model where presumably you're a first-time CEO, is something we see oftentimes as a red flag. Another one on the customer side is high churn, meaning do they lose a lot of their customers every year? And you can do a lot of fancy business school analysis, and we do, trying to understand the quality of a business. One of the single best metrics that you can look at is what percentage of your customers stay with you every year. And if that number is really, really high, it probably means you provide distinctive value. And if that number, if a lot of customers leave you every year, that's a very leaky bucket to fill, and also probably speaks to the business quality. And then the last one is just the end markets, making sure you're in either a stable or a growing end market. Cyclical end markets, where you're selling to new housing starts or, commodities or something like that. Generally, private equity does those transactions, generally not great for first-time CEOs. We've just seen a lot of problems understanding the timing of those cycles and the impact on the revenue and the profitability. So just a few red flags that we see kind of over and over again in due diligence, and certainly what we look for as we're doing checklists with our CEOs and residents.
Excellent points, Alex. I want to go back to where you started, which is the company even sellable? I try and explain that your company is a machine. It takes in revenue and it throws out profit. That's fantastic. The question is, will that machine have value in somebody else's hands? Are you somebody who is the subject matter expert, and God forbid you were to go out in the parking lot and get struck by lightning? Does your company still function tomorrow? If it doesn't, then the question becomes, how can it function in somebody else's hands? So it's not only, so one issue is, are you the subject matter expert? And then second is, as you said, are all the clients there because of you? And do you have those relationships with customers throughout the company, so that if in fact something were to happen to you or you to sell your company, somebody else can step into those shoes, and that machine continues to produce that, take in revenue and produce profits. If in fact you find the answers to that is no, there's work to be done on your company before bringing it to market. It means that it's probably not marketable now, but it doesn't mean that you can't change that in a year or two. So we've worked with companies that basically, yes, the owner was the one who had control of the top 5 client relationships representing 50 or 60% of the revenue. Well, over a period of a year, they introduced other people in. They backed out a little bit. They're second in command and third in command. And that deepened the relationship between the company and those clients, but also made the company stronger, and it made it more sellable. Client concentration, I think, depends a little bit on the kind of business that you're in. If you are in residential roofing, then chances are you're going to have a fair amount of churn in your clients. You fix a roof, you don't need to do it again for 20 years. The question is, what is your business methodology to ensure that new customers are going to be replacing there? In the government contracting world, what we find to be critically important is backlog. I don't want to hear only about the wonderful contracts you have today, but I want to know what the period of performance is and how much backlog do you have. So kind of a rule of thumb for a government contracting company is that you should have in backlog equal to at least 2 years of your trailing 12-month revenue. And that is what I would expect to see. When I see more than 2 years, I'm very happy. When I see less than 2 years, I know a bank is going to get very concerned about that. Now, it's interesting. We're talking to veterans. Some will be interested in government contracting, some not. And we've already talked about some of the challenges to using a search fund model for government contracting because of the set-aside issues. But in the commercial world, you tend not to have 5-year contracts. I mean, one of the advantages of GovCon is you can have that base year contract with 3 or 4 or 5 option years, and that's fantastic. In the commercial world, it's really a question of whether or not the customers that you're working with today are folks that need to be replaced every year, or do you have essentially recurring revenue, even if it's not contractually mandated. And that's one of the ways in which construction firms get sold. Very often, construction firms are contract or project-based. You do a project, move on, you do another project. Well, you're doing projects for the same type of client or the same client, or do you need to find new clients each time? So it really varies depending upon your industry. If you're GovCon, not GovCon, if you're IT, managed services, or construction, each one is unique. But you've got to be looking at what are the strengths of that company, as well as what are the challenges, and what will not only the buyer be concerned about, but what will the buyer's financing sources be concerned about?
Yeah, absolutely. Agree entirely on that. I mean, I think, there was a question in the chat on, specific for SDVOSBs, and I know, Sharon, you touched on this. What we advise searchers looking at government contractors. I mean, one, obviously the critical piece is making sure your cap table, your equity table will maintain that SDVOSB status post transaction if that's critical to the business. And so understanding, the contract mix, how much of it comes from small business set aside, SDVOSB set aside, how much are full and open contracts, meaning they're competing, against the universe of large companies. That will drive a lot of that diligence, and that'll drive generally a lot of the valuation that you see in an SDVOSB. If an SDVOSB is primarily full and open, that's a very, very different multiple than one that is 100% SDVOSB. And there's nothing right or wrong about it, but that's just the reality of the universe of buyers for those businesses.
A very important point, Alex. Thank you for making it. If you are in what I refer to as set-aside world, whether it's SDVOSB, small business, women-owned, et cetera, the multiple is going to have a certain range. If you're in the full and open, that range is going to be higher. What happens is that, let's say you've got an SDVOSB and you're under a $30 million NICS code size limit, and you now have a 5-year revenue average where you're approaching 25, 26. What do? Buyers tend to buy with the expectation of growing. They don't want to buy your company and have to tread water. Because when they're looking at, let's say, paying you a 4 or 5 times multiple, that means that they are paying the profits for your company. They're paying you the profits for the next 4 or 5 years. Well, they want to make money during that time period as well. And the way in which they're going to do that is by growing. We're finding that there is a growing market of companies that are going to be sizing out, who are interested in sizing out big. And there's actually a real market beginning to develop where buyers are coming in and acquiring companies that have not yet sized out but are getting close, and paying a 4 or 5 multiple, getting them into the full and open market, and then being able to sell them in the future at a 7, 8 multiple, essentially the same company. Now, going from the set aside to full and open is a risk, and hence buyers will get a discount for taking that risk. If the seller doesn't want to give that discount, then the seller needs to bring the company into the full and open market. But that risk is going to be borne by somebody, and whoever bears that risk is going to be rewarded for it financially if they succeed.
That's great, Trent. And the last thing I would add, just sort of circling back to the beginning of the conversation, one of the mistakes we often see in due diligence is, as a buyer, make sure you're explaining the why to the seller. We've seen people who send over literally a 700-line data request list in Excel with every single piece of data you could imagine. It is much more effective to explain, again, going back to the empathy and understanding what the seller wants and is concerned with. Explain why you need that data, right? Say, hey, this is the analysis we're trying to do. This is what we're trying to unpack. This is what we're trying to understand. That's why I'm asking for the last 4 years XYZ customer data, right? It's much more effective. This is especially in small business land, this is often 99% of the time the first transaction that a seller is doing, and the only transaction a seller will ever do. And so just remembering this is a human interaction and relationship, and trying to create that mutual trust and understanding, we found to be incredibly helpful throughout the due diligence process.
One of the questions asked is, what do you expect to see in the difference in multiples for an SDVOSB versus a full and open? I wish I could give you a simple answer to that. It depends upon many factors. Clearly, that's one, and it's important. But one company might have 5% margins, and the other could have 20% margins. One company could have very little backlog, and one could have a huge amount of backlog. But if you're talking about two equally situated companies, similar backlog, similar margins, similar customer concentration or lack thereof, generally in the set-aside market, the multiples range between 3 on the low side to about 6, 6.5, sometimes even a little bit higher there with structuring. On the full and open side, you're more likely to see it starting at like 5 or 6 and going up to about 8 or 9. Those are extraordinarily broad ranges. Every circumstance is going to be different, but there's a benefit to the owner of being in that full and open market. I also saw a comment saying that SDVOSB must have 51% ownership control. That is correct. Alex and I worked on a study with Baker Botts recently on how do you maintain that 51%, and the rules are a little bit more stringent for veterans than for anybody else. So I want to wrap up and move to our next speaker. I believe that's going to be Mike Marr, who will interview a veteran searcher, Jordan, on how to find a strong target. Mike, please take it away.
Thanks, Sharon and Alex. That was super informative. I need to spend more time with both of you. Holy cow, this was great. And for those in the audience who feel like some of this information is a little bit daunting or overwhelming, don't worry. You'll get the hang of it. I tell you, when I started down this path, before I went to business school, I thought PE stood for physical education. I had no idea what private equity was all about. Look, we're really privileged to have Jordan Inman with us, and I'm excited to hear a little bit about his journey. Jordan, who with his business partner and fellow veteran James Maxwell acquired a small business via the self-funded model. Jordan, can you give the audience a little background on yourself and tell us a little bit about the business that you've acquired?
Yeah, absolutely, Mike. First of all, thanks for having me. It's a privilege to be here. The veteran community and now the ETA community, they have a special place in my heart. They've had such a huge impact on who I am today. So I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you guys, and Mike, you've been fantastic. So my story kind of started like everybody else. After high school, I went down to college, but I didn't go to college to actually learn anything. I went down to play some football, and I ended up getting a degree in communications. After school, I still didn't want to have a regular job, so I joined the military. I joined the Marine Corps, went in as an officer. I was assigned the MOS of infantry, so I was an infantry guy. Spent a year in Virginia, a couple of years out in 29 Palms, and then Camp Pendleton. And my wife and I in 2015 had our first child. And the military was really tough on just raising a family and everything. So we made the decision to convert out. We moved up to the Pacific Northwest, where I fell in at the private sector. Started working for a home builder up in the Pacific Northwest as a project manager, and then took on as the operations manager for that company. Put myself through Harvard Business School through their executive education program kind of during that time. And then, I met up with James, who's my partner. We actually joined the Marine Corps at the same time. He crossed deck into the Navy. But he kept talking. He was going to Berkeley at the time, and he kept talking about this thing called ETA and buying a business. I had never heard of it at the time, and this is 2021, the summer of 21. And we're at his kitchen countertop, and he's like, "Hey man, we got to buy a business together. This is what we're gonna do." And to me, it was totally foreign concept. He was throwing out these words like SBA and SDE. And he had recommended that I read the Harvard Business Review book. I think it's called Think Big, Buy Small. And I was going on vacation that weekend with my family, and I ended up neglecting my family altogether. I read that book, front to back. And then when I came back, I'm like, all right, it's time. Let's do this. So that's kind of how our ETA journey started together over the kitchen countertop, just kind of talking about it before we decided to commit.
Great, Jordan. Good story. I didn't know that about James. I think he's smarter than I even thought. You know, he transferred from the Marine Corps to the Navy. That's awesome.
Yeah, you'd be surprised.
All right, Jordan, tell us a little bit about the business that you did acquire.
Yep. So we started searching in 2021, self-funded. We actually found our business. I think we closed November 1st of 2021. We bought a commercial janitorial company. The company's comprised at the time was comprised of about 150 reoccurring contracts, mainly nighttime servicing commercial buildings. So servicing everything from Class A office space, automotive, it could be dental offices, kind of a mixed bag. We do offer some daytime janitorial services, carpet cleaning, window cleaning, stuff like that. At the time when we bought the company, it was doing about 1.5 million in revenue, and the seller's discretionary earnings, I think, were right around that 500K mark. The purchase, I want to say we bought it for 1.8 is what we landed on. So just over 3 times SDE. And we've had it for about a year now, just over a year. And since then, we're at about 2 million in revenue. Our EBITDA is just shy of 6 in 2021, which we've grown. And I think a key thing in our business is we no longer say SDE, because when we bought the business, it was owner operated. James and I have now removed ourselves from the business. So we've hired a GM. We have multiple layers of managers now. So the business, we've removed ourselves from the day-to-day operations. We very much work on the business, not in the business. So it's been absolutely fantastic thus far.
All right, terrific. Sounds like a successful acquisition for you. So, Jordan, maybe share with the audience what you think were some of the key elements of the process that enhance the probability of finding a good target and getting it to close.
Yeah, so being new to this, starting out from scratch, I was definitely not an expert in search. The first thing that James and I knew we really need to do is double down on our criteria. Like what were we actually trying to buy? And we looked at all kinds of different metrics, industries. That one of the key things we had going for us is we knew that we had moved to the Pacific Northwest to raise our families, and we knew that's where we wanted to be. So the geographic location of our search was actually, very narrow, which was very helpful. So we were able to say no to a lot of things. We knew we wanted a business model with recurring revenue. We knew we wanted something business to business. We were looking for something that had been around for 10 plus years. And we kind of narrowed all this criteria down by, a lot of discussions, a lot of research on our own. But the most important thing I would say to me personally, and I know is super important for James, is, we were looking to buy a small business, but when you think about a small business, it's almost like somebody's baby. These people, owners have worked in these companies and built these companies for decades, and it's a very special thing to them. And we knew that we wanted to come in, we were going to buy it, but we wanted to have a relationship with the seller. So relationship was super important to us. It's important for James and I to be active in the community and give back to the community as much as possible. We're not looking to buy and flip or inject some crazy amount of growth. We really want to buy somebody's essentially legacy and build onto it and be a part of that legacy and go from there. So the relationship was absolutely critical for us in our search. And then, I would say with the criteria, it's really easy to get sidetracked because there's so many shiny objects out there. Once we really narrowed down what we were looking for, we had to say no to a lot of good ideas that kind of came across our plate. But that was kind of step one. The second thing we did in our search is we had to leverage expertise. So as I've said before, I didn't know what ETA was, a month prior to searching. So I really had to lean on experts out in the field who had been there, done that. I'll throw a plug in there for Lisa. You know, the SBA was one of the more intimidating things for me personally. I'd not heard of the SBA, didn't know how we were going to finance a deal. And Lisa was able to, you know, she had PDFs, YouTube videos on how to use the YouTube videos. She basically drew it up for Cran, with Cran for James and I, and helped us along the way, so that the thing that was the most complicated for me became the easiest, in all reality. But yeah, leveraging our networks here in the local area, and then just really leaning on mentors who'd kind of done some of this stuff, and leveraging our network for what it was. And then, you know, identifying the sellers was critical as well, and leaning on, we knew we wanted to establish a relationship. So, you know, really building relationships with brokers in the area was critical for us, because the brokers, you know, led us to some deals. And then when we did find business owners, there was a lot of business owners that I had talked to that actually weren't interested in selling their business, but those relationships helped me as a buyer, because as I got to build that relationship and get to know them and understand what their needs were, it really helped us out. So I would say those three key areas really helped us in our search. Clearly defined criteria, leveraging subject matter experts and people who can help us out, and then you know, finding sellers, building relationships, and really just humbling up, asking the questions, and going after it.
Great advice. What about tactically? You know, what did you do sort of day to day, or that, you know, you think was helpful?
Yeah, so I heard the question earlier, can you do this while holding down a job? And my advice would be the same. I wouldn't recommend it. But I am somebody who had a job and did a search. You have to be extremely disciplined when searching. And I think looking back, I would go both feet in if I were to repeat the process. But really started out with developing our criteria, and then I literally did a Google search and found about 100 different businesses that fit my criteria, and then lined out the ones that we didn't want. And then it was committing on a daily basis what's the most important next step that we can do. It was a ton of phone calls, a ton of networking, a ton of relationship building. Any industry that we thought we were going to find a deal in, or you know, we were automatically doing due diligence before we even knew that we could even get into the space, setting up connections across the country with people who might be in a similar industry, and asking them questions, just nonstop networking on a daily basis. And the one thing that I think makes James and I unique is once we commit, we fully commit. So there was not like is this a full-time thing? It was every waking moment we were getting after it. That includes weekends, you know, early mornings, late at night. I can tell you during the search, I don't think I slept a full 8 hours the entire time. Luckily, we found our deal pretty quickly. So.
Well, that's pretty intense, Jordan. I mean, with that intensity of activity, I imagine there were some pretty interesting lessons learned. What do you think you learned along the way?
Who I am today. So 2021 is not that long ago. It's you know, to call it a year and a half. By jumping in and actually doing something, you know, if you study the adult learning method, some of us learn by hearing, by seeing, and by doing. I have to learn by doing. So by humbling up and asking every question to people like Lisa, connecting with people like Mike on the call, man, you just learn by getting in there, rolling up your sleeves, you know, making a ton of mistakes, but always getting better. One of the things that, you know, I think that was super important is how to talk to a seller or broker. Wasn't necessarily good at it from the start, but through repetition, you continually get better. And then, you know, the veteran community on this call right now, you should have a lot of confidence, because, you know, you're really a perfect fit for some of these businesses that are looking to turn their company over. You know, you have such an advantage in leadership. Just coming to the table and being open and honest about who you are, what you're about. You know, it was instrumental in our success, and we've just really developed. I think our people skills is the number one thing we developed through this whole thing, and it's been absolutely super fun. I can't say enough about it.
Yeah. Anything else? That's a good segue there. Anything else that you think helped prepare you for this ETA path that you brought with you from the military?
I'll share a quick story. So as an infantry officer, I remember being on the flight line in Afghanistan preparing for a mission, and we spent 2 weeks rehearsing day in, day out, day in, day out. The mission, goes down, and there's a saying in the military that no plan survives first contact. We land, and sure enough, the guy who's supposed to kick off the entire operation sprains his ankle, and we're without a signal plan, and you're just adapting and kind of overcoming. I would say in the ETA world, whether you're searching for a business, have a small business, you're gonna come across the unknown sometimes. I mean, anything and everything can happen. It's super fun. It's just that every day provides another challenge, and that is very much what the military is. The Marine Corps, there was never a dull moment. It was just about what's the obstacle in front of us and how do we overcome it. It's very much about teamwork. Maybe I don't have the ability to overcome this obstacle, but together we do. Finding the right people, surround yourself with the right people, and then just getting after it and having fun doing it.
I only regret, Jordan, that we didn't get a chance to finance you and James and be part of your team, because I would love to follow you guys anywhere with that kind of an attitude. That's awesome. A couple of questions. We got a couple more minutes here. A couple of quick questions. One is, since you've never run a janitorial business, how did you think about that learning curve of getting into that business?
I may have not run a janitorial business, but going through officer candidate school, I definitely swabbed the deck from time to time. So part of our search, we knew in the acquisition process that when we were targeting a business, we wanted to be able to wrap our heads around the industry. And janitorial is super simple. Anybody can pick up a mop and physically do the work. Understanding our company, the thing that might be a little more difficult is how do you actually run the physical business side of the house. I feel that the military really set me up for the leadership piece, for the structure piece. My time outside of the Marine Corps, is running somebody else's business for all intents and purposes. So running, anything that we didn't know how to run the business here, we just ask for help, we network, and we really lean on what resources we have.
Oh, that's terrific. That's terrific. Well, Jordan, look, thank you for taking us on that journey. It's great to hear, and you should be an inspiration to others who want to pursue the self-funded path to ETA. And a shameless plug here for folks like me and Alex in the organization. If you want to do it with experienced investors, the traditional, a funded route is a great way to go as well. Like I said at the beginning of the show, this is all about a personal choice for you, but the resources are there if you seek them out. Jordan, we all wish you and James much success with your business and look forward to building a relationship over the long term. And now for final remarks, the co-host of this national conference, Sharon Heaton, CEO of sbLiftOff. Over to you, Sharon.
Thank you, Mike. Really appreciate it. So veteran entrepreneurship through acquisition, it's a very big topic. I want to thank all the speakers, from Bob Eisiminger, who told us his success story, to Scott Jensen, who advocates for veterans every day in his role as executive director of the NVSBC. And all the speakers who discuss some of the really big issues, such as how do I fund my search? How do I fund the acquisition? What are the issues in due diligence and in negotiation? And how do I find a strong target? These are all major issues. But I want to pull back just a little bit to give more perspective. As veterans, you've provided an invaluable service to this nation. As business owners, your service will continue. Business owners, whether you start the company or you buy it, are the backbone of the US economy. These are the people who take an idea, take action, hire employees, pay taxes, and support their local community. sbLiftOff co-hosts this annual program with our favorite not-for-profit, the National Veterans Small Business Coalition. If you've enjoyed this program, please become a member or a sponsor. The National Veterans Small Business Coalition, because veterans mean business. Thank you so much for attending.